This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Upton. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Chapter 11, Book 1. Maggie tries to run away from her shadow. Maggie's intentions, as usual, were on a larger scale than Tom imagined. The resolution that gathered in her mind after Tom and Lucy had walked away was not so simple as that of going home. No, she would run away and go to the gypsies, and Tom should never see her any more. That was by no means a new idea to Maggie. She had been so often told she was like a gypsy and half wild, that when she was miserable it seemed to her that the only way of escaping opprobrium and being entirely in harmony with circumstances would be to live in a little brown tent on the commons. The gypsies, she considered, would gladly receive her and pay her much respect on account of her superior knowledge. She had once mentioned her views on this point to Tom, and suggested that he should stain his face brown, and they should run away together, but Tom rejected the scheme with contempt, observing that gypsies were thieves, and hardly got anything to eat, and had nothing to drive but a donkey. Today, however, Maggie thought her misery had reached a pitch at which gypsydom was her refuge, and she rose from her seat on the roots of the tree with the sense that this was a great crisis in her life. She would run straight away till she came to Dunlow Common, where there would certainly be gypsies, and cruel Tom and the rest of her relations who found fault with her should never see her any more. She thought of her father as she ran along, but she reconciled herself to the idea of parting with him by determining that she would secretly send him a letter by a small gypsy who would run away without telling where she was, and just let him know that she was well and happy and always loved him very much. Maggie soon got out of breath with running, but by the time Tom got to the pond again she was at the distance of 3 long fields, and was on the edge of a lane leading to the high road. She stopped to pant a little, reflecting that running away was not a pleasant thing until one had got quite to the common where the gypsies were, but her resolution had not abated. She presently passed through the gate into the lane, not knowing where it would lead her, for it was not this way that they came from Dorlcote Mill to Garum Firs, and she felt all the safer for that, because there was no chance of her being overtaken. But she was soon aware, not without trembling, that there were 2 men coming along the lane in front of her. She had not thought of meeting strangers. She had been too much occupied with the idea of her friends coming after her. The formidable strangers were 2 shabby-looking men with flushed faces, one of them carrying a bundle on a stick over his shoulder, but to her surprise, while she was dreading their disapprobation as a runaway, the man with the bundle stopped, and in a half-whining, half-coaxing tone asked her if she had a copper to give a poor man. Maggie had a 6pence in her pocket, her uncle Glegg's present, which she immediately drew out and gave this poor man with a polite smile, hoping he would feel very kindly towards her as a generous person. "That's the only money I've got," she said apologetically. "Thank you, little miss," said the man in a less respectful and grateful tone than Maggie anticipated, and she even observed that he smiled and winked at his companion. She walked on hurriedly, but was aware that the 2 men were standing still, probably to look after her, and she presently heard them laughing loudly. Suddenly it occurred to her that they might think she was an idiot. Tom had said that her cropped hair made her look like an idiot, and it was too painful an idea to be readily forgotten. Besides, she had no sleeves on, only a cape and bonnet. It was clear that she was not likely to make a favourable impression on passengers, and she thought she would turn into the fields again, but not on the same side of the lane as before, lest they should still be Uncle Pullet's fields. She turned through the first gate that was not locked, and felt a delightful sense of privacy in creeping along by the hedgerows after her recent humiliating encounter. She was used to wandering about the fields by herself, and was less timid than on the high road. Sometimes she had to climb over high gates, but that was a small evil. She was getting out of reach very fast, and she should probably soon come within sight of Dunlow Common, or at least of some other common, for she had heard her father say that you couldn't go very far without coming to a common. She hoped so, for she was getting rather tired and hungry, and until she reached the gypsies there was no definite prospect of bread and butter. It was still broad daylight, for Aunt Pullet, retaining the early habits of the Dodson family, took tea at 4:30 by the sun, and at 5 by the kitchen clock. So, though it was nearly an hour since Maggie started, there was no gathering gloom on the fields to remind her that night would come. Still, it seemed to her that she'd been walking a very great distance indeed, and it was really surprising that the common did not come within sight. Hitherto she had been in the rich parish of Garum, where there was a great deal of pasture land, and she had only seen one labourer at a distance. That was fortunate in some respects, as labourers might be too ignorant to understand the propriety of her wanting to go to Dunlow Common. Yet it would have been better if she could have met someone who would tell her the way without wanting to know anything about her private business. At last, however, the green fields came to an end, and Maggie found herself looking through the bars of a gate into a lane with a wide margin of grass on each side of it. She had never seen such a wide lane before, and without her knowing why, it gave her the impression that the common could not be far off. Perhaps it was because she saw a donkey with a log to his foot feeding on the grassy margin, for she had seen a donkey with that pitiable encumbrance on Dunlow Common when she had been across it in her father's gig. She crept through the bars of the gate and walked on with new spirit, though not without haunting images of Apollyon and a highwayman with a pistol, and a blinking dwarf in yellow with a mouth from ear to ear, and other miscellaneous dangers. For poor little Maggie had at once the timidity of an active imagination and the daring that comes from overmastering impulse. She had rushed into the adventure of seeking her unknown kindred, the gypsies, and now she was in this strange lane, she hardly dared look on one side of her, lest she should see the diabolical blacksmith in his leathern apron grinning at her with arms akimbo. It was not without a leaping of the heart that she caught sight of a small pair of bare legs sticking up, feet uppermost, by the side of a hillock. They seemed something hideously preternatural, a diabolical kind of fungus, for she was too much agitated at the first glance to see the ragged clothes and the dark shaggy head attached to them. It was a boy asleep, and Maggie trotted along faster and more lightly, lest she should wake him. It did not occur to her that he was one of her friends the gypsies, who in all probability would have very genial manners. But the fact was so, for at the next bend in the lane Maggie actually saw the little semicircular black tent with the blue smoke rising before it, which was to be her refuge from all the blighting obloquy that had pursued her in civilized life. She even saw a tall female figure by the column of smoke, doubtless the gypsy mother, who provided the tea and other groceries. It was astonishing to herself that she did not feel more delighted, but it was startling to find the gypsies in a lane after all, and not on a common. Indeed, it was rather disappointing for a mysterious, illimitable common, where there were sand-pits to hide in, and one was out of everybody's reach, had always made part of Maggie's picture of gypsy life. She went on, however, and thought with some comfort that gypsies most likely knew nothing about idiots, so there was no danger of their falling into the mistake of setting her down at first glance as an idiot. It was plain she had attracted attention, for the tall figure, who proved to be a young woman with a baby on her arm, walked slowly to meet her. Maggie looked up in the new face rather tremblingly as it approached, and was reassured by the thought that her Aunt Pullet and the rest were right when they called her a gypsy, for this face with the bright dark eyes and the long hair was really something like what she used to see in the glass before she cut her hair off. "My little lady, where are you going?" the gypsy said in a tone of coaxing deference. It was delightful, and just what Maggie expected. The gypsies saw at once that she was a little lady, and were prepared to treat her accordingly. "Not any farther," said Maggie, feeling as if she were saying what she had rehearsed in a dream. "I've come to stay with you, please." "That's pretty. Come then. Why, what a nice little lady you are, to be sure," said the gypsy, taking her by the hand. Maggie thought her very agreeable, but wished she had not been so dirty. There was quite a group round the fire when she reached it. An old gypsy woman was seated on the ground nursing her knees, and occasionally poking a skewer into the round kettle that sent forth an odorous steam. Two small shock-headed children were lying prone and resting on their elbows, something like small sphinxes, and a placid donkey was bending his head over a tall girl who, lying on her back, was scratching his nose and indulging him with a bit of excellent stolen hay. The slanting sunlight fell kindly upon them, and the scene was really very pretty and comfortable, Maggie thought, only she hoped that they would soon set out the teacups. Everything would be quite charming when she had taught the gypsies to use a washing basin and to feel an interest in books. It was a little confusing, though, that the young woman began to speak to the old one in a language which Maggie did not understand, while the tall girl, who was feeding the donkey, sat up and stared at her without offering any salutation. At last the old woman said, "What, my pretty lady, are you come to stay with us? Sit ye down and tell us where you come from." It was just like a story. Maggie liked to be called pretty lady and treated in this way. She sat down and said, "I am come from home because I am unhappy, and I mean to be a gypsy. I'll live with you if you like, and I can teach you a great many things." "Such a clever little lady," said the woman with the baby, sitting down by Maggie and allowing the baby to crawl. "And such a pretty bonnet and frock," she added, taking off Maggie's bonnet and looking at it while she made an observation to the old woman in the unknown language. The tall girl snatched the bonnet and put it on her own head, hind foremost, with a grin. But Maggie was determined not to show any weakness on this subject, as if she were susceptible about her bonnet. "I don't want to wear a bonnet," she said. "I'd rather wear a red handkerchief like yours," looking at her friend by her side. "My hair was quite long till yesterday, when I cut it off, but I dare say it will grow again very soon," she added apologetically, thinking it probable the gypsies had a strong prejudice in favour of long hair. And Maggie had forgotten even her hunger at that moment in the desire to conciliate gypsy opinion. "Oh, what a nice little lady, and rich, I'm sure," said the old woman. "Don't you live in a big beautiful house at home?" "Yes, my home is pretty, and I'm very fond of the river where we go fishing, but I'm often very unhappy. I should have liked to bring my books with me, but I came away in a hurry, you know. But I can tell you almost everything there is in my books. I've read them so many times, and that will amuse you. And I can tell you something about geography too. That's about the world we live in. Very useful and interesting. Did you ever hear about Columbus?" Maggie's eyes had begun to sparkle and her cheeks to flush. She was really beginning to instruct the gypsies and gaining great influence over them. The gypsies themselves were not without amazement at this talk, though their attention was divided by the contents of Maggie's pocket, which the friend at her right hand had by this time emptied without attracting her notice. "Is that where you live, my little lady?" said the old woman at the mention of Columbus. "Oh no," said Maggie with some pity. "Columbus was a very wonderful man, who found out half the world, and they put chains on him and treated him very badly, you know. It's in my catechism of geography, but perhaps it's rather too long to tell before tea. I want my tea so." The last words burst from Maggie in spite of herself, with a sudden drop from patronising instruction to simple peevishness. "Why, she's hungry, poor little lady," said the younger woman. "Give her some of the cold victual. You've been walking a good way, I'll be bound, my dear. Where's your home?" "It's Dorlcote Mill, a good way off," said Maggie. "My father is Mr. Tulliver, but we mustn't let him know where I am, else he'll fetch me home again. Where does the Queen of the Gypsies live?" "What, do you want to go to her, my little lady?" said the younger woman. The tall girl, meanwhile, was constantly staring at Maggie and grinning. Her manners were certainly not agreeable. "No," said Maggie, "I'm only thinking that if she isn't a very good queen, you might be glad when she died, and you could choose another. If I was queen, I'd be a very good queen, and kind to everybody." "Here's a bit o' nice victual, then," said the old woman, handing to Maggie a lump of dry bread which she had taken from a bag of scraps, and a piece of cold bacon. "Thank you," said Maggie, looking at the food without taking it, "but will you give me some bread and butter and tea instead? I don't like bacon." "We got no tea nor butter," said the old woman, with something like a scowl, as if she was getting tired of coaxing. "Oh, a little bread and treacle would do," said Maggie. "We hadn't got no treacle," said the old woman crossly, whereupon there followed a sharp dialogue between the two women in their unknown tongue, and one of the small sphinxes snatched at the bread and bacon and began to eat it. At this moment the tall girl, who had gone a few yards off, came back and said something which produced a strong effect. The old woman, seeming to forget Maggie's hunger, poked the skewer into the pot with new vigour, and the younger crept under the tent and reached out some platters and spoons. Maggie trembled a little and was afraid the tears would come into her eyes. Meanwhile the tall girl gave a shrill cry, and presently came running up the boy whom Maggie had passed as he was sleeping, a rough urchin about the age of Tom. He stared at Maggie, and there ensued much incomprehensible chattering. She felt very lonely, and it was quite sure she should begin to cry before long. The gypsies didn't seem to mind her at all, and she felt quite weak among them. But the springing tears were checked by new terror when two men came up, whose approach had been the cause of the sudden excitement. The elder of the two carried a bag which he flung down, addressing the women in a loud and scolding tone, which they answered by a shower of treble sauciness, while a black cur ran barking up to Maggie and threw her into a tremor that only found a new cause in the curses with which the younger man called the dog off, and gave him a rap with a great stick he held in his hand. Maggie felt that it was impossible she should ever be queen of these people, or ever communicate to them amusing and useful knowledge. Both the men now seemed to be inquiring about Maggie, for they looked at her, and the tone of the conversation became of that pacific kind which implies curiosity on one side and the power of satisfying it on the other. At last the younger woman said in her previous deferential coaxing tone, "This nice little lady's come to live with us. Aren't you glad?" "Aye, very glad," said the younger man, who was looking at Maggie's silver thimble and other small matters that had been taken from her pocket. He returned them all except the thimble to the younger woman with some observation, and she immediately restored them to Maggie's pocket, while the men seated themselves and began to attack the contents of the kettle, a stew of meat and potatoes, which had been taken off the fire and turned out into a yellow platter. Maggie began to think that Tom must be right about the gypsies. They must certainly be thieves, unless the man meant to return her thimble by and by. She would willingly have given it to him, for she was not at all attached to her thimble, but the idea that she was among thieves prevented her from feeling any comfort in the revival of deference and attention toward her. All thieves, except Robin Hood, were wicked people. The woman saw she was frightened. "We've got nothing nice for a lady to eat," said the old woman in her coaxing tone, "and she's so hungry, sweet little lady." "Here, my dear, try if you can eat a bit of this," said the younger woman, handing some of the stew on a brown dish with an iron spoon to Maggie, who, remembering that the old woman had seemed angry with her for not liking the bread and bacon, dared not refuse the stew, though fear had chased away her appetite. If her father would but come by in the gig and take her up, or even if Jack the giant killer, or Mr. Greatheart, or St. George, who slew the dragon on the halfpennies, would happen to pass that way. But Maggie thought with a sinking heart that these heroes were never seen in the neighbourhood of St. Oggs. Nothing very wonderful ever came there. Maggie Tulliver, you perceive, was by no means that well-trained, well-informed young person that a small female of 8 or 9 necessarily is in these days. She had only been to school a year at St. Oggs, and had so few books that she sometimes read the dictionary. so that in travelling over her small mind you would have found the most unexpected ignorance as well as unexpected knowledge. She could have informed you that there was such a word as polygamy, and being also acquainted with polysyllable, she had deduced the conclusion that poly meant many. But she had no idea that gypsies were not well supplied with groceries, and her thoughts generally were the oddest mixture of clear-eyed acumen and blind dreams. Her ideas about the gypsies had undergone a rapid modification in the last 5 minutes. From having considered them very respectful companions, amenable to instruction, she began to think that they meant perhaps to kill her as soon as it was dark and cut up her body for gradual cooking. The suspicion crossed her that the fierce-eyed old man was in fact the devil, who might drop that transparent disguise at any moment and turn either into the grinning blacksmith or else a fiery-eyed monster with dragon's wings. It was no use trying to eat the stew, and yet the thing she most dreaded was to offend the gypsies by betraying her extremely unfavourable opinion of them, and she wondered, with a keenness of interest that no theologian could have exceeded, whether, if the devil were really present, he would know her thoughts. "What? Don't you like the smell of it, my dear?" said the young woman, observing that Maggie did not even take a spoonful of the stew. "Try a bit, come." "No, thank you," said Maggie, summoning all her force for a desperate effort, and trying to smile in a friendly way. "I haven't time, I think. It seems getting darker. I think I must go home now, and come again another day, and then I can bring you a basket with some jam tarts and things." Maggie rose from her seat as she threw out this illusory prospect, devoutly hoping that Apollyon was gullible, but her hopes sank when the old gypsy woman said, stop a bit, little lady. We'll take you home all safe when we've done supper. You shall ride home like a lady." Maggie sat down again, with little faith in this promise, though she presently saw the tall girl putting a bridle on the donkey and throwing a couple of bags on his back. "Now then, little missus," said the younger man, rising and leading the donkey forward, "tell us where you live. What's the name of the place?" "Dorlcote Mill is my home," said Maggie eagerly. "My father is Mr. Tulliver. He lives there." "What? A big mill a little way this side of St. Oggs?" "Yes," said Maggie. "Is it far off? I think I should like to walk there, if you please." No, it be getting dark. We must make haste, and the donkey'll carry you as nice as can be. You'll see." He lifted Maggie as he spoke and set her on the donkey. She felt relieved that it was not the old man who seemed to be going with her, but she had only a trembling hope that she was really going home. "Here's your pretty bonnet," said the younger woman, putting that recently despised but now welcome article of costume on Maggie's head. "And you'll say we've been very good to you, won't you? And what a nice little lady we said you was." "Oh yes, thank you," said Maggie. "I'm very much obliged to you. But I wish you'd go with me too." She thought anything was better than going with one of the dreadful men alone. It would be more cheerful to be murdered by a larger party. "Ah, you're fondest of me, aren't you?" said the woman. "But I can't go. You'll go too fast for me." It now appeared that the man also was to be seated on the donkey, holding Maggie before him, and she was as incapable of remonstrating against this arrangement as the donkey himself, though no nightmare had ever seemed to her more horrible. When the woman had patted her on her back and said "Goodbye," the donkey, at a strong hint from the man's stick, set off at a rapid walk along the lane towards the point Maggie had come from an hour ago, while the tall girl and the rough urchin, also furnished with sticks, obligingly escorted them for the first 100 yards, with much screaming and thwacking. Not Leonore, in that preternatural midnight excursion with her phantom lover, was more terrified than poor Maggie in this entirely natural ride on a short-paced donkey, with a gypsy behind her who considered that he was earning half a crown. The red light of the setting sun seemed to have a portentous meaning, with which the alarming bray of the second donkey with the log on its foot must surely have some connection. 2 low-thatched cottages, the only houses they passed in this lane, seemed to add to its dreariness. They had no windows to speak of, and the doors were closed. It was probable that they were inhabited by witches, and it was a relief to find that the donkey did not stop there. At last, oh, sight of joy! This lane, the longest in the world, was coming to an end, was opening on a broad high road where there was actually a coach passing. And there was a finger-post at the corner. She had surely seen that finger-post before. To St. Oggs, 2 miles. The gypsy really meant to take her home then. He was probably a good man after all, and might have been rather hurt at the thought that she didn't like coming with him alone. This idea became stronger as she felt more and more certain that she knew the road quite well, and she was considering how she might open a conversation with the injured gypsy, and not only gratify his feelings, but efface the impression of her cowardice, when, as they reached a crossroad, Maggie caught sight of someone coming on a white-faced horse. "Oh, stop, stop!" she cried out. "There's my father! Oh, father, father!" The sudden joy was almost painful, and before her father reached her she was sobbing. Great was Mr. Tulliver's wonder, for he had made a round from Basset, and had not yet been home. "Why, what's the meaning of this?" he said, checking his horse while Maggie slipped from the donkey and ran to her father's stirrup. "The little miss lost herself, I reckon," said the gypsy. "She'd come to our tent at the far end of Dunlow Lane, and I was bringing her where she said her home was. It's a good way to come after being on the tramp all day." "Oh, yes, father, he's been very good to bring me home," said Maggie. "A very kind, good man." "Here then, my man," said Mr. Tulliver, taking out 5 shillings. "It's the best day's work you ever did. I couldn't afford to lose the little wench. Here, lift her up before me." "Why, Maggie, how's this, he said, as they rode along, while she laid her head against her father and sobbed. "How came you to be rambling about and lose yourself?" "Oh, father," sobbed Maggie, "I ran away because I was so unhappy. Tom was so angry with me. I couldn't bear it." "Pooh, pooh," said Mr. Tulliver soothingly. "You mustn't think of running away from father. What'd father do without his little wench?" "Oh, no, I never will again, father. Never." Mr. Tulliver spoke his mind very strongly when he reached home that evening, and the effect was seen in the remarkable fact that Maggie had never heard one reproach from her mother or one taunt from Tom about this foolish business of her running away to the gypsies. Maggie was rather awe-stricken by this unusual treatment, and sometimes thought that her conduct had been too wicked to be alluded to. End of chapter.
Chapter 12 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Breathe. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book number 1, Boy and Girl. Chapter 12, Mr. and Mrs. Glegg at Home. In order to see Mr. and Mrs. Glegg at home, we must enter the town of St. Oggs, that venerable town, with the red-fluted roofs and the broad warehouse gables, where the black ships unlaid themselves of their burdens from the far north, and carry away in exchange the precious inland products, the well-crushed cheese, and the soft fleeces which my refined readers have doubtless become acquainted with through the medium of the best classic pastorals. It is one of those old, old towns which impress one as a continuation and outgrowth of nature, as much as the nests of the bowerbirds or the winding galleries or the white ants, a town which carries the traces of its long growth and history like a millennial tree, and has sprung up and developed in the same spot between a river and a low hill, from the time when the Roman legions turned their backs on it from the camp on the hillside, and the long-haired sea-kings came up the river and looked with fierce, eager eyes at the fatness of the land. It is a town familiar with forgotten years. The shadow of the Saxon hero king still walks there fitfully, reviewing the scenes of his youth and love-time, and is met by the gloomier shadow of the dreadful heathen Dane, who was stabbed in the midst of his warriors by the sword of an invisible avenger, and who rises on autumn evenings like a white mist from his tumulus on the hill, and hovers in the court of the old hall by the riverside, the spot where he was thus miraculously slain in the days before the old hall was built. It was the Normans who began to build that fine old hall, which is, like the town, telling of the thoughts and hands of widely sundered generations. But it is all so old that we look with loving pardon at its inconsistencies, and are well content that they who built the stone oriel, and they who built the Gothic facade, and towers of finest small brickwork, with the trefoil ornament, and the windows and battlements defined with stone, did not sacrilegiously pull down the ancient half-timbered body with its oak-roofed banqueting hall. But older even than this old hall is perhaps the bit of wall now built into the belfry of the parish church, and said to be a remnant of the original chapel dedicated to St. Ogg, the patron saint of this ancient town, of whose history I possess several manuscript versions. I incline to the briefest, since, if it should not be wholly true, it is at least likely to contain the least falsehood. Ogg the son of Beol, says my private hagiographer, was a boatman who gained a scanty living by ferrying passengers across the river Floss. And it came to pass, one evening, when the winds were high, that there sat moaning by the brink of the river a woman with a child in her arms, and she was clad in rags, and had a worn and withered look, and she craved to be rowed across the river. And the men thereabout questioned her, and said, Wherefore dost thou desire to cross the river? Tarry till the morning, and take shelter here for the night, so shalt thou be wise and not foolish. Still she went on to mourn and crave. But Ogg the son of Beol came up and said, I will ferry thee across. It is enough that thy heart needs it. And he ferried her across. And it came to pass, when she stepped ashore, that her rags were turned into robes of flowing white, and her face became bright with exceeding beauty, and there was a glory around it, so that she shed a light on the water like the moon in its brightness. And she said, Ogg the son of Beol, thou art blessed in that thou didst not question and wrangle with the heart's need, but was smitten with pity, and did straightway relieve the same. And from henceforth whoso steps into thy boat shall be in no peril from the storm, and whenever it puts forth to the rescue, it shall save the lives both of men and beasts. And when the floods came, many were saved by the reason of that blessing on the boat. But when Og the son of Beol died, behold, in the parting of his soul, the boat loosed itself from its moorings and was floated with the ebbing tide in great swiftness to the ocean, and was seen no more. Yet it was witnessed in the floods of aftertime, that at the coming on of eventide, Og the son of Beol was always seen with his boat upon the wide-spreading waters, and the Blessed Virgin sat in the prow, shedding a light around as of the moon in its brightness, so that the rowers in the gathering darkness took heart and pulled anew. This legend, one sees, reflects from a far-off time the visitation of the floods, which, even when they left human life untouched, were widely fatal to the helpless cattle, and swept a sudden death over all smaller living things. But the town knew worse troubles, even than the floods, troubles of the civil wars when it was a continual fighting place, where first Puritans thanked God for the blood of the Loyalists, and the Loyalists thanked God for the blood of the Puritans. Many honest citizens lost all their possessions for conscience sake in those times, and went forth, beggared from their native town. Doubtless there are many houses standing now on which those honest citizens turned their backs in sorrow, quaint gabled houses, looking on the river, jammed between newer warehouses, and penetrated by surprising passages, which turn and turn at sharp angles till they lead you out on a muddy strand, overflowed continually by the rushing tide. Everywhere the brick houses have a mellow look, and in Mrs. Glegg's day there was no incongruous new-fashioned smartness, no plate glass in shop windows, no fresh stucco facing or other fallacious attempts to make fine old red St. Oggs wear the air of a town that sprang up yesterday. The shop windows were small and unpretending, for the farmers' wives and daughters who came to do their shopping on market days were not to be withdrawn from their regular well-known shops, and the tradesmen had no wares intended for customers who would go on their way and be seen no more. Ah, even Mrs. Glegg's day seems far back in the past now, separated from us by changes that widen the years. War and the rumour of war had then died out from the minds of men, and if they were ever thought of by the farmers in drab greatcoats, who shook the grain out of their sample bags and buzzed over it in the full marketplace, it was as a state of things that belonged to a past golden age, when prices were high. Surely that time was gone forever, when the broad river could bring up unwelcome ships. Russia was the only place where the linseed came from. The more the better, making grist for the great vertical millstones with their scythe-like arms, roaring and grinding and carefully sweeping as if an informing soul were in them. The Catholics, bad harvests, and the mysterious fluctuations of trade were the three evils mankind had to fear. Even the floods had not been great of late years. The mine of St. Oggs did not look extensively before or after. It inherited a long past without thinking of it, and had no eyes for the spirits that walked the streets. Since the centuries when St. Ogg with his boat and the Virgin Mother at the prow had been seen on the wide water, so many memories had been left behind and had gradually vanished, like the receding hilltops. And the present time was like the level plain, where men lose their belief in volcanoes and earthquakes, thinking tomorrow will be as yesterday, and the giant forces that used to shake the earth are forever laid to sleep. The days were gone when people could be greatly wrought upon by their faith, still less change it. The Catholics were formidable because they would lay hold of government and property, and burn men alive, not because any sane and honest parishioner of St. Oggs could be brought to believe in the Pope. One aged person remembered how a rude multitude had been swayed when John Wesley preached in the cattle market, but for a long while it had not been expected of preachers that they should shake the souls of men. An occasional burst of fervour in dissenting pulpits on the subject of infant baptism was the only symptom of a zeal unsuited to sober times, when men had done with change. Protestantism sat at ease, unmindful of schisms, careless of proselytism. Dissent was an inheritance along with a superior pew and a business connection, and the churchmanship only wondered contemptuously at dissent as a foolish habit that clung greatly to families in the grocery and chandlering lines, though not incompatible with prosperous wholesale dealing. But with the Catholic question had come a slight wind of controversy to break the calm. The elderly rector had become occasionally historical and argumentative, and Mr. Spray, the independent minister, had begun to preach political sermons, in which he distinguished with much subtlety between his fervent belief in the right of Catholics to the franchise, and his fervent belief in their eternal perdition. Most of Mr. Spray's hearers, however, were incapable of following his subtleties, and many old-fashioned dissenters were much pained by his siding with the Catholics, while others thought he had better let politics alone. Public spirit was not held in high esteem at St. Oggs, and men who busied themselves with political questions were regarded with some suspicion as dangerous characters. They were usually persons who had little or no business of their own to manage, or, if they had, were likely enough to become insolvent. This was a general aspect of things at St. Oggs in Mrs. Glegg's day, and at that particular period in her family history when she had had a quarrel with Mr. Tulliver. It was a time when ignorance was much more comfortable than at present, and was received with all the honours in very good society, without being obliged to dress itself in an elaborate costume of knowledge. A time when cheap periodicals were not, and when country surgeons never thought of asking their female patients if they were fond of reading, but simply took it for granted that they preferred gossip. A time when ladies in rich silk gowns wore large pockets, in which they carried a mutton bone to secure them against cramp. Mrs. Glegg carried such a bone, which she had inherited from her grandmother, with a brocaded gown that would stand up empty like a suit of armour, and a silver-headed walking-stick, for the Dodson family had been respectable for many generations. Mrs. Glegg had both a front and a back parlour in her excellent house at St. Oggs, so that she had 2 points of view from which she could observe the weakness of her fellow beings, and reinforce her thankfulness for her own exceptional strength of mind. From her front window she could look down the Tofton Road, leading out of St. Oggs, and note the growing tendency to gadding about in the wives of men not retired from business, together with the practice of wearing woven cotton stockings, which opened a dreary prospect for the coming generation. And from her back windows she could look down the pleasant garden and orchard which stretched to the river, and observe the folly of Mr. Glegg in spending his time among them flowers and vegetables. For Mr. Glegg, having retired from active business as a wool stapler for the purpose of enjoying himself through the rest of his life, had found his last occupation so much more severe than his business, that he had been driven into amateur hard labour as a dissipation, and habitually relaxed by doing the work of 2 ordinary gardeners. The economizing of a gardener's wages might perhaps have induced Mrs. Glegg to wink at this folly, if it were possible for a healthy female mind even to simulate respect for a husband's hobby. But it is well known that this conjugal complacency belongs only to the weaker portion of the sex, who are scarcely alive to the responsibilities of a wife as a constituted check on her husband's pleasures, which are hardly ever of a rational or commendable kind. Mr. Glegg, on his side, too, had a double source of mental occupation, which gave every promise of being inexhaustible. On the one hand, he surprised himself by his discoveries in natural history, finding that his piece of garden ground contained wonderful caterpillars, slugs, and insects, which, so far as he had heard, had never before attracted human observation. He noticed remarkable coincidences between the zoological phenomena and the great events of that time, as, for example, that before the burning of York Minster there had been mysterious serpentine marks on the leaves of the rose trees, together with an unusual prevalence of slugs, which he had been puzzled to know the meaning of, until it flashed upon him with this melancholy conflagration. Mr. Glegg had an unusual amount of mental activity, which, when disengaged from the wool business, naturally made itself a pathway in other directions. And his second subject of meditation was the contrariness of the female mind, as typically exhibited in Mrs. Glegg, that creature made, in a genealogical sense, out of a man's rib, and this particular case maintained in the highest respectability, without any trouble of her own, should be normally in a state of contradiction to the blandest propositions, and even to the most accommodating concessions, was a mystery in the scheme of things, to which he had often in vain sought a clue in the early chapters of Genesis. Mr. Glegg had chosen the eldest, Miss Dodson, as a handsome embodiment of female prudence and thrift, and being himself of a money-getting, money-keeping turn, had calculated on much conjugal harmony. But in that curious compound, the feminine character, it may easily happen that the flavour is unpleasant in spite of excellent ingredients, and a fine systematic stinginess may be accompanied with a seasoning that quite spoils its relish. Now, good Mr. Glegg himself was stingy in the most amiable manner. His neighbours called him near, which always means that the person in question is a lovable skinflint. If you expressed a preference for cheese parings, Mr. Glegg would remember to save them for you, with a good-natured delight in gratifying your palate, and he was given to pet all animals which required no appreciable keep. There was no humbug or hypocrisy about Mr. Glegg. His eyes would have watered with true feeling over the sale of a widow's furniture, which a £5 note from his side pocket would have prevented, but a donation of £5 to a person in a small way of life would have seemed to him a mad kind of lavishness rather than charity, which had always presented itself to him as a contribution of small aids, not a neutralizing of misfortune. And Mr. Glegg was just as fond of saving other people's money as his own. He would have ridden as far round to avoid a turnpike when his expenses were to be paid for him, as when they were to come out of his own pocket. and he was quite zealous in trying to induce indifferent acquaintances to adopt a cheap substitute for blacking. This inalienable habit of saving, as an end in itself, belonged to the industrious men of business of a former generation, who made their fortunes slowly, almost as the tracking of the fox belongs to the harrier. It constituted them a race which is nearly lost in these days of rapid money-getting, when lavishness comes close on the back of want. In old-fashioned times, an independence was hardly ever made without a little miserliness as a condition, and you would have found that quality in every provincial district, combined with characters as various as the fruits from which you can extract acid. The true Harpagons were always marked and exceptional characters, not so the worthy taxpayers, who, having once pinched from real necessity, retained even in the midst of their comfortable retirement, with their wall-fruit and wine-bins, the habit of regarding life as an ingenious process of nibbling out one's livelihood without leaving any perceptible deficit, and who would have been as immediately prompted to give up a newly taxed luxury when they had had their clear 500 a year, as when they had only £500 of capital. Mr. Glegg was one of these men, found so impracticable by Chancellors of the Exchequer, and knowing this, you will be the better able to understand why he had not swerved from the conviction that he had made an eligible marriage, in spite of the too pungent seasoning that nature had given to the eldest Miss Dodson's virtues. A man with an affectionate disposition, who finds a wife to concur with his fundamental idea of life, easily comes to persuade himself that no other woman would have suited him so well, and does a little daily snapping and quarrelling without any sense of alienation. Mr. Glegg, being of a reflective turn, and no longer occupied with wool, had much wondering meditation on the peculiar constitution of the female mind, as unfolded to him in his domestic life, and yet he thought Mrs. Glegg's household ways a model for her sex. It struck him as a pitiable irregularity in other women if they did not roll up their table napkins with the same tightness and emphasis that Mrs. Glegg did, if their pastry had a less leathery consistence, and their damson cheese a less venerable hardness than hers. Nay, even the peculiar combination of grocery and drug-like odors in Mrs. Glegg's private cupboard impressed him as the only right thing in the way of cupboard smells. I am not sure that he would not have longed for the quarrelling again if it had ceased for an entire week, and it is certain that an acquiescent, mild wife would have left his meditations comparatively jejune and barren of mystery. Mr. Glegg's unmistakable kind-heartedness was shown in this, that it pained him more to see his wife at variance with others, even with Dolly the servant, than to be in a state of cavil with her himself. And the quarrel between her and Mr. Tulliver vexed him so much that it quite nullified the pleasure he would otherwise have had in the state of his early cabbages, as he walked in his garden before breakfast the next morning. Still, he went in to breakfast with some slight hope that, now Mrs. Glegg had slept upon it, her anger might be subdued enough to give way to her usually strong sense of family decorum. She had been used to boast that there had never been any of those deadly quarrels among the Dodsons which had disgraced other families, that no Dodson had ever been cut off with a shilling, and no cousin of the Dodsons disowned as, indeed, why should they be? For they had no cousins who had not money out at use, or some houses of their own, at the very least. There was one evening cloud which had always disappeared from Mrs. Glegg's brow when she sat at the breakfast table. It was her fuzzy front of curls, for as she occupied herself in household matters in the morning, it would have been a mere extravagance to put on anything so superfluous to the making of leathery pastry as a fuzzy curled front. By 10:30, decorum demanded the front. Until then, Mrs. Glegg could economize it, and society would never be any the wiser. But the absence of that cloud only left it more apparent that the cloud of severity remained, and Mr. Glegg, perceiving this, as he sat down to his milk porridge, which it was his old frugal habit to stem his morning hunger with, prudently resolved to leave the first remark to Mrs. Glegg, lest, to so delicate an article as a lady's temper, The slightest touch should do mischief. People who seem to enjoy their ill temper have a way of keeping it in fine condition by inflicting privations on themselves. That was Mrs. Glegg's way. She made her tea weaker than usual this morning, and declined butter. It was a hard case that a vigorous mood for quarrelling, so highly capable of using an opportunity, should not meet with a single remark from Mr. Glegg on which to exercise itself. But by and by it appeared that his silence would answer the purpose, for he heard himself apostrophized at last in that tone particular to the wife of one's bosom. "Well, Mr. Glegg, it's a poor return I get for making you the wife I've made you all these years. If this is the way I'm to be treated, I'd better had known it before my poor father died. And then, when I'd wanted a home, I should have gone elsewhere, as a choice was offered me." Mr. Glegg paused from his porridge and looked up, not with any new amazement, but simply with that quiet, habitual wonder with which we regard constant mysteries. "Why, Mrs. G., what have I done now?" "Done now, Mr. Glegg? Done now? I am sorry for you." Not seeing his way to any pertinent answer, Mr. Glegg reverted to his porridge. "There's husbands in the world," continued Mrs. Glegg after a pause, "as would have known how to do something different to siding with everybody else against their own wives. Perhaps I'm wrong, and you can teach me better, but I always heard as it's the husband's place to stand by the wife, instead of rejoicing and triumphing when folks insult her." "Now, what call have you to say that?" said Mr. Glegg, rather warmly, for though a kind man, he was not as meek as Moses. "When did I rejoice or triumph over you?" "There's ways of doing things worse than speaking out plain, Mr. Glegg. I'd sooner you tell me to my face as you make light of me, than try to make out as everybody's in the right but me, and come to your breakfast in the morning as I've hardly slept an hour this night, and sulk at me as if I was the dirt under your feet." "Sulk at you?" said Mr. Glegg, in a tone of angry facetiousness. "You're like a tipsy man as thinks everybody's had too much but himself." "Don't lower yourself with using coarse language to me, Mr. Glegg. It makes you look very small, though you can't see yourself," said Mrs. Glegg, in a tone of energetic compassion. "A man in your place should set an example and talk more sensible." "Yes, but will you listen to sense?" retorted Mr. Glegg sharply. "The best sense I can talk to you is what I said last night, as you're in the wrong to think of calling in your money when it's safe enough, if you'd let it alone all because of a bit of a tiff, and I was in hopes you'd had altered your mind this morning. But if you'd like to call it in, don't do it in a hurry now, and breed more enmity in the family, but wait till there's a pretty mortgage to be had without any trouble. You'd have to set a lawyer to work now to find an investment and make no end of expense." Mrs. Glegg felt there was really something in this, but she tossed her head and emitted a guttural interjection to indicate that her silence was only an armistice, not a peace. And in fact, hostilities soon broke out again. "I'll thank you for my cup of tea now, Mrs. G.," said Mr. Glegg, seeing as she did not proceed to give it to him as usual, when he had finished his porridge. She lifted the teapot with a slight toss of the head and said, "I'm glad to hear you'll thank me, Mr. Glegg. It's little thanks I get for what I do for folks in this world, though there's never a woman on your side of the family, Mr. Glegg, as is fit to stand up with me, and I'd say it if I was on my dying bed. Not but what I've always conducted myself civil to your kin, and there isn't one of 'em can say the contrary, though my equals they aren't, and nobody shall make me say it." "You'd better leave finding fault with my kin till you've left off quarrelling with your own, Mrs. G.," said Mr. Glegg, with angry sarcasm. "I'll trouble you for the milk jug." "That's as false a word as ever you spoke, Mr. Glegg," said the lady, pouring out the milk with unusual profuseness, as much as to say, if he wanted milk, he should have it with a vengeance. And it's false. I'm not the woman to quarrel with my own kin. You may, for I've known you to do it. Why, what did you call it yesterday, then? Leaving your sister's house in a tantrum? I'd no quarrel with my sister, Mr. Glegg, and it's false to say it. Mr. Tulliver is none of my blood, and it was him quarrelled with me and drove me out of the house. But perhaps you'd have had me stay and be swore at, Mr. Glegg. Perhaps you was vexed not to hear more abuse and foul language poured out upon your own wife. But let me tell you, it's your disgrace. Did ever anybody hear the like this parish? Said Mr. Glegg, getting hot. A woman, with everything provided for her, and allowed to keep her own money the same as if it was settled on her, and with a gig new stuffed and lined at no end of expense, and provided for when I die beyond anything she could expect, to go on, in this way, biting and snapping like a mad dog. It's beyond everything as God Almighty should have made women so. These last words were uttered in a tone of sorrowful agitation. Mr. Glegg pushed his tea from him and tapped the table with both hands. Well, Mr. Glegg, if those are your feelings, it's best they should be known, said Mrs. Glegg, taking off her napkin and folding it in an excited manner. But if you talk of my being provided for beyond what I could expect, I beg leave to tell you as I'd a right to expect a many things as I don't find. And as to my being like a mad dog, it's well if you're not cried shame on by the country for your treatment of me, for it's what I can't bear, and I won't bear. Here Mrs. Glegg's voice intimated that she was going to cry, and breaking off from speech, she rang the bell violently. Sally, she said, rising from her chair and speaking in rather a choked voice, light a fire upstairs and put the blinds down. Mr. Glegg, you'll please do order what you'd like for dinner. I shall have gruel. Mrs. Glegg walked across the room to the small bookcase and took down Baxter's Saint's Everlasting Rest, which she carried with her upstairs. It was the book she was accustomed to lay open before her on special occasions, on wet Sunday mornings, or when she heard of a death in the family, or when, as in this case, her quarrel with Mr. Glegg had been set an octave higher than usual. But Mrs. Glegg carried something else upstairs with her, which, together with the Saint's Rest and the gruel, may have had some influence in gradually calming her feelings, and making it possible for her to endure existence on the ground floor, shortly before tea-time. This was, partly, Mr. Glegg's suggestion that she would do well to let her 500 lie still until a good investment turned up, and further, his parenthetic hint at his handsome provision for her in case of his death. Mr. Glegg, like all men of his stamp, was extremely reticent about his will, and Mrs. Glegg, in her gloomier moments, had forebodings that, like other husbands of whom she had heard, he might cherish the mean project of heightening her grief at his death by leaving her poorly off, in which case she was firmly resolved that she would have scarcely any weeper on her bonnet, and would cry no more than if he had been a second husband. But if he had really shown her any testamentary tenderness, it would be affecting to think of him, poor man, when he was gone. And even his foolish fuss about the flowers and garden stuff, and his insistence on the subject of snails, would be touching when it was once fairly at an end. To survive Mr. Glegg, and talk eulogistically of him, as a man who might have his weaknesses, but who had done the right thing by her, notwithstanding his numerous poor relations, to have sums of interest coming in more frequently and secreted in various corners, baffling to the most ingenious of thieves. For to Mrs. Glegg's mind, banks and strong boxes would have nullified the pleasure of property. She might as well have taken her food in capsules. Finally, to be looked up to by her own family and the neighborhood, so as no woman can ever hope to be who has not the praetorite and present dignity comprised in being a widow well left. All this made a flattering and conciliatory view of the future, so that when good Mr. Glegg, restored to good humour by much hoeing, and moved by the sight of his wife's empty chair, with her knitting rolled up in a corner, went upstairs to her, and observed that the bell had been tolling for poor Mr. Morton, Mrs. Glegg answered magnanimously, quite as if she had been an uninjured woman. "Ah, then, there'll be a good business for somebody to take to." Baxter had been open at least 8 hours by this time, for it was nearly 5 o'clock, and if people are to quarrel often, it follows as a corollary that their quarrels cannot be protracted beyond certain limits. Mr. and Mrs. Glegg talked quite amicably about the Tullivers that evening. Mr. Glegg went the length of admitting that Tulliver was a sad man for getting into hot water, and was like enough to run through his property. And Mrs. Glegg, meeting this acknowledgment halfway, declared that it was beneath her to take notice of such a man's conduct, and that, for her sister's sake, she would let him keep the 500 a while longer, for when she put it out on a mortgage, she should only get 4%. End of chapter 12. Book number 1, Boy and Girl. Recording by Breathe.
Chapter 13 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 1, Boy and Girl. Chapter 13. Mr. Tulliver further untangles the skein of life. Owing to this new adjustment of Mrs. Glegg's thoughts, Mrs. Pullet found her task of mediation the next day surprisingly easy. Mrs. Glegg, indeed, checked her rather sharply for thinking it would be necessary to tell her elder sister what was the right mode of behaviour in family matters. Mrs. Pullet's argument, that it would look ill in the neighbourhood if people should have it in their power to say that there was a quarrel in the family, was particularly offensive. If the family name never suffered except through Mrs. Glegg, Mrs. Pullet might lay her head on her pillow in perfect confidence. "It's not to be expected, I suppose," observed Mrs. Glegg by way of winding up the subject, "as I shall go to the mill again before Bessy comes to see me, or as I shall go and fall down on my knees to Mr. Tulliver, and ask his pardon for showing him favours. But I shall bear no malice, and when Mr. Tulliver speaks civil to me, I'll speak civil to him. Nobody has any call to tell me what's becoming." Finding it unnecessary to plead for the Tullivers, it was natural that Aunt Pullet should relax a little in her anxiety for them, and recur to the annoyance she had suffered yesterday from the offspring of that apparently ill-fated house. Mrs. Glegg heard a circumstantial narrative, to which Mr. Pullet's remarkable memory furnished some items, and while Aunt Pullet pitied poor Bessy's bad luck with her children, and expressed a half-formed project of paying for Maggie's being sent to a distant boarding-school, which would not prevent her being so brown, but might tend to subdue some other vices in her, Aunt Glegg blamed Bessy for her weakness, and appealed to all witnesses who should be living when the Tulliver children had turned out ill, that she, Mrs. Glegg, had always said how it would be from the very first, observing that it was wonderful to herself how all her words came true. "Then I may call and tell Bessy you'll bear no malice, and everything be as it was before?" Mrs. Pullet said just before parting. "Yes, you may, Sophy," said Mrs. Glegg. "You may tell Mr. Tulliver, and Bessy too, as I'm not going to behave ill because folks behave ill to me. I know it's my place, as the eldest, to set an example in every respect, and I do it. Nobody can say different of me, if they'll keep to the truth." Mrs. Glegg being in this state of satisfaction in her own lofty magnanimity, I leave you to judge what effect was produced on her by the reception of a short letter from Mr. Tulliver that very evening, after Mrs. Pullet's departure, informing her that she needn't trouble her mind about her £500, for it should be paid back to her in the course of the next month at farthest, together with the interest due thereon until the time of payment. And furthermore, that Mr. Tulliver had no wish to behave uncivilly to Mrs. Glegg, and she was welcome to his house whenever she liked to come, but he desired no favours from her, either for himself or his children. It was poor Mrs. Tulliver who had hastened this catastrophe, entirely through that irrepressible hopefulness of hers, which led her to expect that similar causes may at any time produce different results. It had very often occurred in her experience that Mr Tulliver had done something because other people had said he was not able to do it, or had pitied him for his supposed inability, or in any other way piqued his pride. Still, she thought to-day, if she told him when he came in to tea that Sister Pullet was gone to try and make everything up with Sister Glegg, so that he needn't think about paying in the money, it would give a cheerful effect to the meal. Mr Tulliver had never slackened in his resolve to raise the money, but now he at once determined to write a letter to Mrs Glegg, which should cut off all possibility of mistake. Mrs Pullet gone to beg and pray for him, indeed! Mr Tulliver did not willingly write a letter, and found the relation between spoken and written language, briefly known as spelling, one of the most puzzling things in this puzzling world. Nevertheless, like all fervid writing, the task was done in less time than usual, and if the spelling differed from Mrs Glegg's, why, she belonged, like himself, to a generation with whom spelling was a matter of private judgment. Mrs Glegg did not alter her will in consequence of this letter, and cut off the Tulliver children from their 6th and 7th share in her £1,000, for she had her principles. No one must be able to say of her when she was dead that she had not divided her money with perfect fairness among her own kin. In the matter of wills, personal qualities were subordinate to the great fundamental fact of blood, and to be determined in the distribution of your property by caprice, and not make your legacies bear a direct ratio to degrees of kinship, was a prospective disgrace that would have embittered her life. This had always been a principle in the Dodson family. It was one form of that sense of honour and rectitude which was a proud tradition in such families, a tradition which has been the salt of our provincial society. But though the letter could not shake Mrs Glegg's principles, it made the family breach much more difficult to mend; and as to the effect it produced on Mrs Glegg's opinion of Mr Tulliver, she begged to be understood from that time forth that she had nothing whatever to say about him. His state of mind, apparently, was too corrupt for her to contemplate it for a moment. It was not until the evening before Tom went to school, at the beginning of August, that Mrs Glegg paid a visit to her sister Tulliver, sitting in her gig all the while, and showing her displeasure by markedly abstaining from all advice and criticism. For, as she observed to her sister Deane, "Bessy must bear the consequence of having such a husband, though I'm sorry for her." And Mrs Deane agreed that Bessy was pitiable. That evening Tom observed to Maggie, "Oh my! Maggie, Aunt Glegg's beginning to come again. I'm glad I'm going to school. You'll catch it all now." Maggie was already so full of sorrow at the thought of Tom's going away from her, that this playful exultation of his seemed very unkind, and she cried herself to sleep that night. Mr Tulliver's prompt procedure entailed on him further promptitude in finding the convenient person who was desirous of lending £500 on bond. "It must be no client of Wakem's," he said to himself, and yet at the end of a fortnight it turned out to the contrary, not because Mr Tulliver's will was feeble, but because external fact was stronger. Wakem's client was the only convenient person to be found. Mr Tulliver had a destiny as well as Oedipus, and in this case he might plead, like Oedipus, that his deed was inflicted on him rather than committed by him. End of Book 1, Chapter 13. Recording by Leanne Howlett.